She was late. It wasn't just a few minutes, it was the kind of lateness that feels like a physical weight, pressing against her chest as she power-walked through the lobby of Jo Enterprises. Her heel had caught in a grate 2 blocks back, and now every step had a rhythmic, mocking click-thud that announced her failure to the entire marble-floored lobby. The elevator was a cathedral of glass and brushed steel, intimidating, silent, and cold. It was the kind of space that seemed designed to make a new hire feel small before they even reached their desk. Abigale slammed the button for the 40th floor and leaned against the mirrored back wall, closing her eyes for a jagged breath. She checked her reflection. Her blazer was slightly skewed, and a stray braid had escaped her polished updo. She tucked it back with trembling fingers, adjusting her collar and smoothing the fabric over her heart. Professional. Polished. You belong here, she lied to her reflection. The doors glided open at the lobby level. A man stepped in. Abigale's immediate thought was that he moved like water, fluid, effortless, and entirely too slow for her current heart rate. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than her entire college tuition, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of obsidian. He didn't rush. He didn't even look at the panel. He just stood there, hands clasped loosely in front of him, radiating a level of composure that felt like an insult to her frantic energy. The doors hissed shut. The silence in the elevator wasn't empty, it was heavy, pressing in on her until the air felt thin. Abigale looked at him. He was staring at nothing, his expression a mask of calm indifference. She was like this when she was under pressure. She couldn't handle the quiet. Silence felt like an admission of guilt. The 40th floor is actually in the same building, she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. In case you were wondering why the elevator is moving. He didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head, his dark eyes settling on her with a look of quiet, detached curiosity. Is it? He asked, his voice a low, smooth baritone. The elevator was a claustrophobic box of mirrored perfection, and Abigale Key was currently shattering the silence within it. She didn't just feel late, she felt exposed. Every time the elevator slowed to a crawl or the doors lingered a second too long at a mid-level floor, she felt a fresh surge of adrenaline, the kind that usually signaled a fight-or-flight response. Since she couldn't flee, she chose to fight. She shifted her weight, the uneven rhythm of her broken heel tapping against the steel floor like a frantic telegraph. Beside her, the man, Suk Jo, remained an island of infuriating stillness. He hadn't even reached for the panel. He simply stood there, radiating an aura of expensive, unbothered peace that felt like a personal insult to her chaos. You know, there's actually an unspoken etiquette to these things, Abigale snapped, her voice echoing sharply off the glass. She didn't look at him directly, she addressed his reflection, her eyes narrowed and her finger pointing toward the row of glowing buttons. In a building this size, efficiency is everything. When someone is clearly in a rush, you don't just stand there like you're waiting for a bus in the park. You push the close door button. You move with purpose. Suk Jo didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping over a frantic expression with a detached, clinical interest. Purpose, he repeated, the word sounding low and smooth, like a cello note. Yes, purpose. Abigale's frustration boiled over. This is Jo Enterprises, not a vacation resort. My mother always said you can judge a company's health by its lobby, and honestly, if the employees here are all as relaxed as you, I'm starting to wonder if I made a mistake accepting the offer. Useless employees who treat the hallway like a lounge are the reason projects fail and stocks dip. She was on a roll now, the nervous energy of her first day manifesting as a lecture she had no right to give. She gestured sharply at his charcoal suit. You look like you've got the wardrobe for the job, but do you have the drive? Because right now, you're just dead weight in a very expensive cage. A subtle, ghost of a smirk tugged at the corner of Suk Jo's mouth. He didn't defend himself. He didn't point out that he hadn't pressed a button because his floor required a keycard he hadn't yet produced. He simply leaned back slightly, crossing his arms over his broad chest, his eyes shimmering with a quiet, dangerous amusement. Dead weight, he mused, his voice devoid of any real offense. That's a bold diagnostic for a 2-minute ride, MS. Key. Abigale Key, she supplied, tossing her head back with a flash of defiant pride. And I don't need 2 minutes to spot a bottleneck. Maybe if you spent less time smirking and more time pushing that button, some of us could actually keep our jobs. The elevator chimed, a polite, digital sound that felt far too calm for the tension Abigale had created. The doors slid open to the 40th floor. She didn't wait for a reply. With a final, huffed breath of exasperation, she marched out into the plush carpeting of the reception area, leaving the silent man behind to the mirrors and his own amused reflections. The 40th floor reception area was a hive of hushed voices and frantic efficiency, a stark contrast to the heavy silence of the elevator. Abigale smoothed her blazer one last time, her heart still hammering against her ribs. She was 20 minutes early for the orientation, plenty of time to bury the memory of the dead-weight stranger and his infuriating smirk. She checked her reflection in a glass partition. The fire was still in her eyes, but it was now channeled into a rigid, professional mask. She had come here to be the best, and if that meant lecturing a few slow-moving co-workers along the way, so be it. By 9:55 a.m., the glass-walled auditorium was filled with the scents of expensive coffee and fresh cologne. Abigale sat in the third row, her notebook open, pen poised. She felt a surge of pride as she looked around at the other new hires. They were all sharp, but she knew she had an edge, a grit they lacked. "Please settle in," a sleek woman with a headset announced from the podium. "We are honored to have the chairman join us today to personally welcome this cohort. He rarely makes these appearances, so please, give him your undivided attention." The room went dead silent. The side door opened, and a man stepped through with the same fluid, effortless grace Abigale had witnessed only moments ago. Her breath caught in her throat. Her pen slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor, but she didn't move to pick it up. She couldn't. It was him. The charcoal suit was unmistakable. The broad shoulders and the dark hair, pushed back with effortless precision, were exactly as they had been in the mirrored cage of the elevator. But the relaxed posture was gone, replaced by a terrifying, silent authority that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. He didn't look like a man who struggled with lobby etiquette, he looked like a man who owned the lobby, the elevator, and every soul currently holding their breath inside his building. Suk Jo stepped behind the mahogany lectern. He didn't look at his notes. He scanned the crowd, his gaze moving with a slow, predatory patience. Abigale felt her face go from hot to ice cold as his eyes finally reached the third row. He didn't stop. He didn't call her out. But he paused, just for a fraction of a second, and that same subtle, dangerous smirk returned, the one she had mocked as a sign of laziness. "Welcome to Jo Enterprises," he began, his baritone voice filling the hall with a resonance that made Abigale's skin crawl. "At this company, we value many things. Efficiency. Drive. But above all." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a piercing intensity. "We value people who can spot a bottleneck. Even if they don't yet know who they are looking at." Abigale sank into her chair, the weight of the executive floor realization hitting her like a physical blow. She hadn't just insulted a colleague, she had diagnosed the king of the empire as dead weight, and now, the king was looking right at her. For the next 72 hours, Abigale Key perfected the art of corporate disappearance. The fiery woman who had lectured a billionaire on efficiency was gone, replaced by a ghost in a sensible gray blazer who navigated the office by hugging the shadows of oversized Monstera plants and ducking into supply closets whenever a pair of expensive Italian loafers clicked down the hallway. She stayed buried behind her dual-monitor setup, her posture so rigid it bordered on skeletal. Every time the heavy glass doors of the executive wing hissed open, her heart performed a frantic tap dance against her ribs. She kept her head down, her eyes anchored to spreadsheets and data entries, praying that the sheer volume of her output would act as a cloaking device. If she was productive enough, she reasoned, she would just be another nameless gear in the machine, too useful to fire, but too boring to remember. Lunch was a hurried affair of protein bars eaten in the safety of a bathroom stall or a deserted stairwell. She avoided the cafeteria like a minefield, terrified that a chance encounter over the salad bar would lead to a performance review that ended with her security badge being snapped in half. Her initial, first-day energy had curdled into a high-functioning paranoia. By Wednesday afternoon, her eyes ached from staring at the glowing screens, but she didn't dare lean back or stretch. To be still was to be seen. She had become an expert at peripheral vision, she could identify the gait of every senior manager on the floor, yet she remained perpetually tuned to the specific, rhythmic stride of the men she had called dead weight. The irony was a bitter pill. She had spent years working toward this position, dreaming of making a name for herself at Jo Enterprises. Now, her greatest ambition was to have no name at all. She was a shadow among the steel and glass, a ghost in the machine, desperately hoping that Suk Jo had more important things to do than seek vengeance on a mid-level hire with a broken heel and a big mouth. But the silence from the top floor felt less like forgetfulness and more like a held breath. Every time an internal memo arrived or her phone buzzed with a notification, Abigale froze, her breath hitching. She was waiting for the axe to fall, unaware that in the glass-walled office 30 floors above, a pair of dark, amused eyes were occasionally checking the productivity logs of a certain new hire in the finance department, watching the invisible girl work with a ferocity that was anything but quiet. Thursday arrived with the kind of heavy, gray sky that threatened a downpour, mirroring the gloom that had settled over Abigale's desk. She had managed 72 hours of successful anonymity, but the streak ended at exactly 4:15 p.m. with a notification that didn't come from her manager, her supervisor, or even HR. The email was 3 lines long, sent from a generic executive assistant address, but the signature was a black-inked death warrant, Office of the Chairman. Abigale didn't move for a full minute. Her co-workers were packing up, chatting about happy hour and weekend plans, while she sat paralyzed by a single sentence: "A car is waiting for you at the north entrance. The chairman requires your presence for an off-site briefing." Her walk to the elevators felt like a march to the gallows. She caught her reflection in the polished steel doors, the same ones where she had sealed her fate on Monday. Today, her blazer was straight and her hair was impeccable, but her eyes were wide with a raw, visceral dread. She had tried to be a ghost, but apparently, Suk Jo was an expert at hauntings. When she stepped out of the lobby, the rain had begun, a cold, needle-like drizzle. Waiting at the curb was a black sedan so sleek it looked like it was made of liquid shadow. A driver in a crisp uniform held the door open without a word. There was no company logo on the car, no signage, just the quiet, terrifying hum of absolute power. As the door thudded shut, sealing her in a vault of premium leather and the scent of sandalwood, Abigale realized this wasn't an off-site briefing. It was a summons. The city blurred past the tinted windows, a smudge of neon lights and gray concrete, as the car climbed away from the mid-level bustle of the financial district and toward the winding, exclusive roads of the heights. She clutched her tablet to her chest like a shield, rehearsing apologies she knew would sound hollow. "I'm sorry for calling you dead weight. I'm sorry for lecturing you on your own company." The car slowed, turning into a gated driveway that led to a glass and stone structure overlooking a river. The driver opened her door, and Abigale stepped out into the damp evening air. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling glass that glowed from within. Standing on the wide balcony, silhouetted against the darkening sky, was Suk Jo. He wasn't in his suit jacket anymore, his sleeves were rolled up, and he held a glass of something amber. He didn't turn around immediately. He simply waited for the sound of her heels to stop clicking against the stone. "You've been very quiet the last 3 days, Miss Key," he said, his baritone carrying easily through the rain-cooled air. He finally turned, that same unreadable, amused expression fixed on his face. "I began to miss your thoughts on my lack of purpose. I thought a change of scenery might bring the fire back." The amber liquid in Suk Jo's glass caught the dying light of the skyline as he stepped back from the balcony, gesturing for Abigale to follow him into a sleek, minimalist study. The room felt like an extension of the man himself, cold, precise, and undeniably commanding. On the central marble desk lay a single, thick leather binder. It wasn't the digital file she was used to, it looked like a heavy, physical burden. "You mentioned that efficiency is everything," Suk Jo said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational hum that vibrated in the quiet room. "And you were quite concerned about the dead weight slowing down the company's health. I've decided to take your diagnosis seriously." He tapped the binder. "This is the Vance Global merger. It has been stagnant for 18 months. 3 senior partners have tried to close it, all 3 have failed. It is a bottleneck, I believe you called it." Abigale felt the air leave her lungs. The Vance account was legendary in the firm, a black hole of legal complexities and clashing egos that had swallowed reputations whole. She was a junior analyst on her first week. Putting her on this wasn't just a challenge, it was an execution. "Sir," she started, her voice betraying a slight tremor before she clamped down on it. "I am a new hire. I haven't even finished my HR onboarding." Suk Jo leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. The movement was slow, deliberate, mirroring the way he had leaned against the elevator wall just days before. The others approached it with lobby etiquette, Miss Key. They were polite. They were cautious. They moved like the people you despised in that elevator. "I want to see if that fire you directed at me survives when it's aimed at a target that can actually fight back." He took a step closer, his shadow stretching across the binder until it touched her. "If you succeed, you'll have a career that moves at the speed you demand. If you fail, you'll have proven that your lecture was nothing more than the nervous noise of a girl who talks because she's afraid of the silence." The challenge was a jagged blade, and Abigale had no choice but to grab it by the edge. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but beneath it, her pride began to smolder. He was testing her, yes, but he was also giving her exactly what she had claimed to want, a chance to move faster than everyone else. "I'll need full access to the shadow ledgers," she said, her voice finally finding its footing. "And a direct line to your office. If I'm going to clear the bottleneck, I can't have anyone standing in my way." Suk Jo's smirk didn't just appear, it deepened, a dark glint of approval flashing in his eyes. "The ledgers are already in the file. As for the direct line..." He reached out, his fingers grazing the binder as he pushed it toward her. "Don't make me regret giving it to you." The boardroom was a temple of mahogany and glass, its air cooled to a temperature that felt as clinical as a surgical suite. Abigale stood at the head of the table, the Vance Global files spread before her like a map of a battlefield. It was her 7th day at the firm, and her 4th night without more than 3 hours of sleep. Surrounding her were the gatekeepers, senior partners in suits that whispered of old money and deep-seated resentment, all waiting for the junior analyst to trip over her own ambition. At the far end of the table, Suk Jo sat in shadow. He hadn't said a word since the meeting began. He remained perfectly still, his chin resting on a steepled hand, his presence a silent weight that made the senior partners fidget. Abigale clicked the remote, and a graph slashed across the screen, highlighting a discrepancy in the Vance shadow ledgers that 3 teams of experts had missed. "The bottleneck isn't the valuation," she said, her voice cutting through the room with a clarity that surprised even her. "It's a legacy pension clause from 1994 that's being used as a poison pill by the minority shareholders. They aren't looking for a better deal, they're looking for a reason to kill the merger." A partner to her left, a man named Henderson whose face was the color of a rare steak, let out a dismissive snort. "And you, a trainee, managed to find this in 48 hours. It's a reach, Ms. Key. A desperate one." Abigale didn't look at Henderson. She felt the heat rising in her neck, that familiar spark of lobby fire threatening to ignite. But she didn't snap. She leaned forward, placing her palms flat on the table, and met Henderson's gaze with a chilling, controlled focus. "It's not a reach, Mr. Henderson. It's page 402 of the addendum. Perhaps if you'd spent less time delegating the reading and more time doing it, we wouldn't be 18 months behind schedule." The room went ice cold. Henderson gasped, but before he could retaliate, Abigale's eyes drifted to the end of the table. Suk Jo was looking at her. He wasn't leaning forward to intervene. He wasn't nodding in agreement. He was simply watching her, and for the first time since she had walked into this building, she saw it clearly, the same amused smirk from the elevator. It was subtle, a ghost of a curve at the corner of his mouth, but it was directed entirely at her. It wasn't the look of a boss watching a subordinate, it was the look of a man watching a fire he had started, fascinated by the way it burned. In that look, there was no judgment, only a terrifyingly intimate recognition. He wasn't waiting for her to fail anymore, he was enjoying the show. Abigale felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the presentation and everything to do with the men in the shadows. She realized then that the trial by fire wasn't just about the merger, it was about her, and the fact that he was the only one in the room who truly knew what she was capable of. She turned back to the screen, her heart racing, the smirk burned into her mind like a brand. She didn't just want to close the deal anymore, she wanted to see how much higher she could make that smirk climb. The victory in the boardroom was a double-edged sword, and Abigale soon realized that while she had earned Suk Jo's amusement, she had also painted a target on her back. By Friday morning, the atmosphere in the finance wing had shifted from cold indifference to a thick, suffocating resentment. Leading the charge was Marcus Vane, a senior VP who had occupied his corner office for a decade and viewed Abigale's sudden ascent as a personal localized earthquake. To Marcus, Abigale wasn't a talent, she was a glitch in the system that needed to be purged. It started with small, surgical strikes. A shared drive containing the Vance Global projection suddenly became read-only for her account. A critical meeting with the compliance team was rescheduled without her being notified, leaving her sprinting down the hall 3 minutes after it had ended. But the real venom came in the form of the shadow ledgers. Abigale sat at her desk late Friday evening, the office nearly empty. She opened the master file she had been perfecting for Suk Jo's final review, only to feel the blood drain from her face. The formulas were broken. The legacy pension clauses she had meticulously highlighted had been altered, the numbers shifted just enough to make her previous analysis look like a reckless, amateurish error. Problem with the data, Ms. Key. She looked up to find Marcus leaning against her cubicle wall. He wasn't smirking like Suk Jo, his expression was one of manufactured concern, the kind of mask a predator wears when it's finished playing with its food. I heard the chairman is expecting the final brief by Monday morning, Marcus continued, his voice dripping with a false, oily sympathy. It would be a shame if your lobby fire turned out to be nothing more than a short circuit. Some of us have spent years mastering this floor. You can't just walk in and rewrite the rules because you had a lucky break in an elevator. Abigale stared at the corrupted screen, her fingers curling into fists. She knew his digital footprint would be scrubbed, his trail hidden behind administrative overrides she didn't have the clearance to challenge. He was a snake in the grass, striking from the shadows of a bureaucracy he helped build. I didn't get this job by luck, Mr. Vane, she said, her voice low and dangerously steady. Maybe not, Marcus replied, pushing off the wall. But you'll lose it by incompetence. Good luck fixing that before the sun comes up. As his footsteps faded, Abigale looked at the glowing monitor. The sabotage was deep, intended to break her spirit as much as her data. But Marcus had made one fatal mistake. He assumed she was the same girl who had snapped in the elevator out of fear. He didn't realize that under Suk Jo's gaze, her fire had hardened into steel. She didn't reach for her bag. She reached for her coffee and began to rebuild, cell by cell, determined to prove that a snake could never outrun a fire. The clock on the wall of the executive wing ticked past midnight, the sound echoing through the cavernous, darkened hallways. Abigale's eyes were bloodshot, the blue light of her laptop reflecting in her pupils as she finalized the restoration of the sabotaged files. She was the only soul left on the 40th floor, or so she thought, until the heavy double doors of the chairman's suite creaked open. Suk Jo stood in the threshold, his tie undone and the top buttons of his shirt discarded. He didn't look like the untouchable titan of the boardroom, he looked weary, human, and devastatingly handsome in the low amber light of the corridor. The cleaning crew left 2 hours ago, Ms. Key, he said, his baritone softened by the hour. Even the deadweight knows when to call it a night. Abigale didn't look up from her screen, though her heart had already begun its traitorous thumping. I was at home at 3 a.m., she said, her voice rising with a desperate edge. And yet, your badge scanned into the building at midnight, Marcus noted, his eyes gleaming with the triumph of a trap finally sprung. Several people saw you leaving the executive wing late. It seems the fire you were so proud of was actually a smokescreen for corporate espionage. The security guards moved in, one on each side. The humiliation was a physical weight, a suffocating heat that burned worse than any anger she had felt in the elevator. As they escorted her toward the elevators, the same mirrored cages that had seen her rise, she looked up at the glass balcony of the top floor. Suk Jo was there. He was standing by the railing, looking down at the commotion. From this distance, she couldn't see his eyes, but his posture was as rigid and unreadable as the day they met. He didn't move to stop them. He didn't shout a command. He simply watched as the doors closed on her, the mirrors reflecting a girl who had gone from a rising star to a pariah in the blink of a digital eye. The silence of the elevator was back, but this time, it didn't feel like a challenge, it felt like a tomb. The silence from the executive suite was more deafening than the accusations. For 48 hours, Abigale sat in her cramped apartment, the walls closing in as her phone remained a lifeless slab of glass. She had expected a call, a secret meeting, or even a cold termination letter, anything but the void. When she finally forced herself back to the lobby of Jo Enterprises to demand an audience, the air felt different. The security guards who had once nodded to her now stood like stone sentinels, their gazes sliding past her as if she were already a ghost. She managed to slip into the back of a company-wide town hall, hiding in the shadows of the rear mezzanine, her heart thundering against her ribs. Suk Jo stood on the stage, the light catching the sharp, uncompromising angles of his face. He looked every bit the emperor, distant and absolute. When a brave reporter from a business journal asked about the security breach and the status of the junior analyst involved, the room went so still the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Abigale leaned forward, her fingers white-knuckled against the railing. Say it, she pleaded silently. Tell them it's a setup. Tell them you know who I am. The matter is under internal review, Suk Jo said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. He didn't look toward the mezzanine. He didn't offer a single word of defense or a hint of doubt. Jo Enterprises does not tolerate data instability. The individual in question has been suspended indefinitely. We move forward. The words felt like a physical blow to her chest, stealing the oxygen from her lungs. There was no smirk, no hidden glint of amusement, no recognition of the midnight meal they had shared or the fire he had claimed to admire. He was abandoning her to the wolves of Marcus Vane's making. As the crowd erupted into murmurs of approval for the chairman's decisive leadership, Abigale felt a cold, hollow despair wash over her. She realized then that the power imbalance hadn't shifted during their night in the shadows, it had merely been camouflaged. To him, she was still just a bottleneck that had become too messy to clear. She turned and stumbled toward the exit, the mirrored walls of the hallway mocking her with reflections of a woman who had been foolish enough to believe that a king would bleed for a commoner. The fire that had sustained her since her first day didn't just flicker, it went out, leaving her in a darkness more profound than the one she had fled. Suk Jo's silence hadn't just ended her career, it had rewritten their entire story as a lie. Despair lasted only as long as it took for Abigale to catch her breath. Sitting on a park bench outside the tower, she watched her own reflection in a rain puddle and saw not a victim, but the woman who had dared to tell the most powerful man in the city to move faster. She realized then that Marcus Vane was a creature of habit. In his rush to sabotage her files on Friday, he had used a legacy administrative override, the same poison pill technique she had discovered in the Vance Global pension clauses. He hadn't just framed her, he had left his signature in the logic of the corruption. She didn't need Suk Jo to defend her. She had the one thing that actually mattered in this building, the data. Abigale stood, smoothing her blazer with a sharp, violent precision. She didn't approach the north entrance. She went to the service bay, using a temporary delivery pass she'd forgotten to return. She bypassed the lobby sentinels and stepped into the freight elevator. It was slow, industrial, and lacked the polished mirrors of the public cars, but as it climbed, she felt the fire reignite, hotter and more controlled than ever before. When the doors opened on the 40th floor, she didn't sneak. She marched. The walk of power was a blur of silver and glass. Co-workers shrank back as she passed, her heels striking the floor with the cadence of a war drum. Marcus Vane stepped out of his office, his face twisting into a sneer of disbelief. "You were escorted out, Abigale. If I call security." "Call them," she threw over her shoulder, not even breaking her stride. "Tell them to bring handcuffs for the men who used a 1994 administrative backdoor to mask a file transfer to the Caymans. I've already mirrored the logs to a third-party server, Marcus. Your snake-in-the-grass routine just ran out of lawn." She reached the heavy mahogany doors of the chairman's suite. Two assistants jumped to their feet, but Abigale didn't wait for an introduction. She threw the doors open, the wood hitting the stoppers with a thunderous crack. Suk Jo was standing by the window, his back to her. He didn't jump. He didn't even turn around immediately. "I didn't come here for an apology," Abigale said, her voice vibrating with a lethal clarity. She tossed a flash drive onto his marble desk. "And I didn't come here to be saved. I came here to clear the bottleneck. Marcus Vane is the leak, and the evidence is on that drive. Now, you can either finish the internal review or you can get out of my way so I can finish the merger." Suk Jo finally turned. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum that Abigale filled with her defiance. He looked at the drive, then up at her. For the first time, the smirk was completely gone. In its place was something deeper, a dark, shimmering respect that felt like the first real breath she had taken in a week. He wasn't the king anymore, and she wasn't the hire. They were equals in the wreckage. The silence in the office was no longer a cage, it was a stage. Suk Jo picked up the flash drive, his movements slow and deliberate, the silver casing catching the afternoon sun. He didn't need to plug it in to know she was telling the truth. He had watched her for a week, he knew the difference between the desperate noise of a guilty woman and the focused, lethal precision of Abigale Key when she was right. He walked to his desk, his eyes never leaving hers. "Marcus Vane has been with this firm for 12 years, he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "He was a pillar of the institution." "Then your institution was built on sand," Abigale countered. She didn't move an inch, her shadow stretching long across his marble floor. "He didn't just sabotage me. He gambled with the Vance merger to protect his own ego. He thought he could bury me in the silence you provided for him." Suk Jo set the drive down. He pressed a single button on his intercom. "Security. Escort Marcus Vane to the holding room. Contact the fraud division of the SEC. I want his terminal seized and his credentials wiped within the hour." As the distant sound of a commotion broke out in the hallway, the final, pathetic rattles of a snake being caught, the tension in the room shifted. The professional victory was won, but the air between them remained taut, humming with the unresolved energy of the last 48 hours. "The internal review is concluded," Suk Jo said, stepping around the desk until he was inches from her. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain returned, thick and intoxicating. "You've cleared the bottleneck, Abigale. You've done what 3 senior partners couldn't." "I know I did," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. She didn't look for his approval. She didn't wait for a promotion. She looked him directly in his dark, unreadable eyes. But we aren't done. You stood on that stage and called me data instability. You let the world think I was a thief while you sat in the shadows and watched to see if I'd drown. You treated my life like a stress test for your company. Suk Jo's expression didn't flicker, but the muscle in his jaw tightened. I want it, she pressed, her fire burning white hot. I don't want a bonus. I don't want a corner office. I want the one thing you've never given anyone in this building. I want an apology. Not to the analyst. To me. The silence stretched, agonizing, and heavy. For a moment, she thought he would revert to the Titan, the man who never blinked. Then, the rigid line of his shoulders eased. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of genuine, staggering humility that felt more powerful than any boardroom decree. You're right, he whispered, his gaze returning to hers with a raw, startling honesty. I used your fire to smoke out a traitor, and in doing so, I risked the only thing in this building that was actually real. I am sorry, Abigale. It won't happen again. Abigale exhaled, the weight she'd been carrying finally hitting the floor. She had her name back. She had her pride. And looking at the men before her, she realized she had something far more dangerous, his respect. The rain had returned to Seoul, a soft, rhythmic patter against the glass exterior of Jo Enterprises that blurred the neon lights of Gangnam into a watercolor dream. It was exactly 6 p.m., and the lobby was a sea of umbrellas and departing suits. Abigale Key stepped into the elevator, her stride steady and her heels clicking with a confidence that no longer needed to be rehearsed. Her blazer was perfect, her mind was calm, and for the first time in a month, she wasn't running late. The doors were nearly closed when a hand, strong, familiar, and steady, caught the edge of the steel. Suk Jo stepped inside. The space between them was no longer a battlefield. The clinical, mirrored walls that had once felt like a cage now felt intimate, reflecting two people who had survived the fire they had set together. He wasn't wearing his jacket, his white shirt was crisp, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the forearms of a man who worked as hard as he commanded. He didn't stand on the opposite side this time. He stood beside her, his presence a warm, magnetic weight. The elevator glided upward, the silence between them devoid of the frantic, jagged pressure of their first meeting. Instead, the air hummed with a quiet, subterranean electricity, the kind that exists when everything has been said and only action remains. Abigale caught his reflection in the polished door. He wasn't looking at the floor numbers. He was looking at her, that subtle, deep-seated smirk playing on his lips, but this time it carried a soft, unmistakable warmth. You're on time, he murmured, his baritone vibrating in the small space. I've learned to manage the bottlenecks, Abigale replied, her voice smooth and playful. She reached out, her fingers grazing the panel, but before she could select a floor, his hand covered hers. His skin was warm, his grip firm and intentional. He didn't push a floor button. Instead, he reached for the emergency red switch at the top of the panel. With a decisive click, he pressed the stop button. The elevator jolted slightly and groaned to a halt between the 38th and 39th floors. The sudden stillness was absolute. In the heart of his empire, surrounded by glass and steel, Suk Jo turned to her, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a raw, focused intensity that made her breath hitch. The building can wait, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he stepped into her space, closing the distance until the scent of sandalwood and rain dampened what was all she knew. I think we're long overdue for a conversation that doesn't involve efficiency. Abigale looked up at him, her fire finally meeting its match. She didn't snap. She didn't lecture. She simply reached up and traced the line of his jaw, a slow, triumphant smile of her own finally breaking through. You know, she whispered, if my boss is going to be this disruptive, this job might be a lot harder to get through than I thought. He laughed then, a real, low sound of genuine delight, and as he leaned down, the mirrors reflected a final, perfect image of two equals, finally finding their own rhythm in a world that had tried to keep them apart. In a world governed by titles, LinkedIn profiles, and executive floors, it is easy to fall into the trap of selective kindness, treating those above you with reverence while ignoring or belittling those you perceive as below you.